It all started with an envelope. Not a digital one that you can delete with a satisfying swoosh, but a physical, honest-to-God paper envelope. It was cream-colored, offensively thick, and it lay in my mailbox like a coiled snake. Nothing good ever comes in an envelope that fancy, unless it's a wedding invitation, and I knew for a fact that none of my friends were foolish enough to get married in September. Before the envelope, it had been a perfectly normal Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that's so aggressively mundane you forget it happened even while it's still happening. The sun was shining on Harmony Creek Estates, my personal slice of suburban purgatory. It's a nice place, I guess, if your primary life goal is to live inside a beige paint swatch. The lawns are all cut to a militant 3 inches. Every mailbox is the exact same shade of federally approved black. And the biggest neighborhood drama we'd had in 3 years was when Mr. Henderson from 4B painted his picket fence eggshell instead of the HOA-mandated off-white. You could practically hear the cease and desist letters being drafted in the air. I was on my front porch, nursing a mug of coffee that was rapidly going cold, and staring at my laptop. I'm a graphic designer, which is a fancy way of saying I argue with clients about fonts for a living. My current project was a logo for a new brand of synergistic, holistic, organic dog food. They wanted it to feel both ancient and futuristic, which, as far as I can tell, is a golden retriever wearing a jetpack. My eyes drifted away from the screen, past the perfectly trimmed hedges, and landed on my bicycle. It was a simple trek, a few years old, with a scratch on the frame from that one time I thought I could be a trail guy. It was leaning against the porch wall, where it had been for the better part of a week. My laziness had prevented me from walking it the extra 20 feet to the garage. To me, it wasn't an eyesore. It was a symbol of potential. One of these days, it seemed to whisper, you'll actually go for a ride instead of just thinking about it. It was my 2-wheeled shrine to good intentions. Across the street, Chad, a golden retriever with the smug face of a hedge fund manager, watched me from his lawn. He tilted his head, a silent, furry judgment on my life choices. I gave him a little wave. He did not wave back. This was my life, getting judged by a dog before 9 a.m. It was quiet, it was predictable, and I was, for the most part, content. I had no idea that my lazy monument to potential fitness was about to become the casus belli for the dumbest, most expensive, and most glorious war of my adult life. I just needed to check the mail. I shuffled over to the mailbox in my slippers, pried it open, and there it was. That cream-colored envelope, nestled between a coupon for 2-for-1 pizzas and a credit card offer promising an APR that would make a loan shark blush. The Harmony Creek Estates HOA logo was embossed in the corner in shiny gold foil, like they were the goddamn royal family of lawn maintenance. My stomach did a little flip-flop. I took the mail inside, setting the pizza coupon on the counter. That was important. And held the HOA letter up to the light, as if I could divine its contents through sheer force of will. With a sigh, I ripped it open, tearing the regal embossed seal. The paper inside was just as thick, with the kind of crisp, authoritative feel that's designed to make you feel small. And then I read the words, Official Notice of Bylaw Violation. My eyes scanned the page, my brain struggling to process the corporate jargon. Date of observation, September 9th, 2025. Violation Code 7, 4.3, Storage of personal items on exterior facades. Description of violation 1.1. 2-wheeled conveyance, bicycle, blue, was observed stored in a non-designated area, front porch, adjacent to front door. As per the Harmony Creek Covenants, conditions and restrictions, all personal items must be stored out of public view, either within the garage or in the rear of the dwelling. Required action. Please remove the offending item immediately. Fine assessed, $100, due in 15 days to avoid further penalties. It was signed in a flourish of passive-aggressive elegance by one Brenda McMillan, President, Harmony Creek Estates, HOA. I blinked. I read it again. And then again. $100. They were fining me $100 for a bicycle. A bicycle that, I might add, probably wasn't even worth $100 on Craigslist. The sheer, unadulterated pettiness of it washed over me in waves. I walked through the 5 stages of grief in about 30 seconds. First, denial. This had to be a joke. A prank from Henderson for not returning his leaf blower fast enough. I looked outside, expecting to see him hiding in the bushes, giggling. Nothing. Just Chad, the judgmental dog, still staring. Second, anger. A hot, prickly rage started in my chest. $100? For a bike? Are they high on lawn clippings? I did some quick, furious math. The bike had been there for 6 days. That meant I was being fined $16.66 per day for its existence. I was paying rent for my bicycle to live on my own porch. Third, bargaining. Maybe I could just call them. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Won't happen again. I imagined the phone call. Me, apologetic and reasonable. Them, a faceless bureaucrat on the other end, clicking a pen and probably adding a demerit to my permanent suburban record. Fourth, depression. I slumped onto a kitchen stool, the letter clutched in my hand. This is it. This is my life. Being slowly bled dry by a $100 fine for a bike. Is this what my parents meant when they said being a homeowner was rewarding? And then finally came the 5th stage, acceptance. But I wasn't accepting the fine. Oh no. I was accepting that this was now a war. A cold, suburban, passive-aggressive war of attrition. And if Brenda and the Harmony Creek HOA wanted a war, I was going to give them a masterpiece. The anger didn't fade. It just refined itself. It went from a hot, messy blaze to a cold, sharp, diamond-hard point of focus. My graphic designer brain kicked in. This wasn't a problem anymore. It was a design challenge. The objective? Respond to this absurd fine in a way that was both technically within the rules and a gigantic, unmissable middle finger to the entire concept of the HOA. I did what any sane person would do. I poured myself a generous glass of whiskey. It was just after 9 a.m., but this was a crisis, and opened the file on my computer I'd hoped to never open again. HOA_bylaws_final_updated_v17.pdf. It was a 300-page document filled with enough legalese to put a Supreme Court justice to sleep. A digital paperweight of despair. I put on my thinking music, which consists entirely of epic movie scores, and got to work. With a glass of Lafroig in one hand and my mouse in the other, I started to Ctrl+F my way through the document. I searched for porch, I searched for bicycle, I searched for storage, display, personal items. The bylaws were, as expected, a masterpiece of bureaucratic specificity. They had rules about the acceptable color palette for garden hoses, earth tones only. They had a multi-page section on the appropriate height and material for holiday decorations. They had a clause about trash cans being visible from the street for no more than 12 hours. It was a tyrant's instruction manual for how to crush the human soul with beige paint and petty regulations. And then I found it. It was glorious. It was beautiful. It was a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. The bylaws were incredibly strict about storage. The word was everywhere, always linked with things like garbage, tools, and toys. But they were surprisingly vague about art. Tucked away in Section 11 under Architectural Modifications was the golden ticket. Bylaw, February 1st. 11. Permanent or semi-permanent installations of an artistic or sculptural nature must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval prior to installation. The committee shall review submissions based on aesthetic harmony with the community. My brain, fueled by righteous indignation and single malt scotch, started to spin. They fined me for one bike, calling it storage. They saw a violation. I saw a failure of imagination. What if it wasn't storage? What if my bicycle was a lonely, misunderstood piece of art? And art, as everyone knows, shouldn't be lonely. Art needs friends. Art needs a grand public stage. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. An idea, fully formed and beautifully malicious, bloomed in my mind. If they had a problem with one bike, I was going to give them 10. And I was going to mount them on a professional-grade, powder-coated, bolt-it-to-the-concrete bike rack. It wouldn't be storage. It would be a sculpture, a piece of modern art, a commentary. I grabbed my design tablet, shoved the dog food logo to the side, and started sketching. The war had begun, and I was about to unveil my first weapon. The next 24 hours were a blur of manic energy. Forget client work. Forget cleaning the house. I had a new, all-consuming project. My browser history from that day would look like the digital footprint of a deranged city planner with an art history minor. I dove headfirst into a rabbit hole of municipal supply websites, public park equipment catalogs, and professional cycling forums. I learned more about bike racks than any civilian ever should. Did you know there's a difference between a wave rack and an inverted U rack? Did you know that hot dip galvanization provides superior corrosion resistance compared to zinc plating? I did. I was comparing the tensile strength of different gauges of steel. I was watching YouTube tutorials on how to properly install anchor bolts into a concrete slab. I was a man possessed. My Google searches became increasingly bizarre. Modernist sculpture raw metal. HOA legal precedents public art. Is a bike rack art, if I say it is? Bulk discount on used Schwinn bicycles. How to write a pretentious artist's statement. I quickly realized that my vision, my grand industrial masterpiece, was beyond my meager handyman skills. Trying to install a 200-pound steel rack myself would likely end with me permanently attached to my own porch. I needed a professional. I needed a contractor who would see my vision not as insanity, but as a challenge. The first 2 calls did not go well. Hi, yes, I'm looking to get a quote on installing a commercial-grade 10-bike rack on my front porch, I said into the phone, trying to sound as normal as possible. The guy on the other end, from a company called Prestige Patios, was silent for a long moment. Your porch? Correct, I said cheerfully. As a piece of art. Click. He hung up. The second call, to Custom Concrete Creations, was even shorter. I got as far as 10 bike rack before the woman on the line said, "Is this a prank call?" and hung up. I was starting to lose hope. Maybe my brand of crazy was too unique for the local tradesman. On my third try, I called a number from a beat-up-looking magnet on my fridge that had been there since I moved in. Gus's Gutter and Concrete. We fix it. It sounded promisingly straightforward. A gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Gus. I took a deep breath and gave him the pitch, but this time I changed my strategy. I decided to lead with the truth. Hi, Gus. My name's Mark. I have a weird project, and I'm hoping you're the man for the job. To make a long story short, I want to bolt a 10-bike rack to my porch to piss off my homeowners association. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought he'd hung up too. Then I heard a low, rumbling chuckle. Let me get this straight, Gus's voice crackled. You want to pay me good money to install city park equipment on your front porch as a giant screw you to your neighborhood committee. I'm commissioning a piece of postmodernist art that explores the juxtaposition of domesticity and urban utility, I corrected him. But yes, that too. The chuckle turned into a full-blown laugh. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. "This I gotta see." Gus arrived in a Ford F-150 that looked like it had personally survived several wars. He was a man in his late 60s, with a thick neck, hands like catcher's mitts, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He walked right past me, eyes fixed on the porch, sizing it up like a heavyweight boxer eyeing his opponent. He stomped on the pavers, kicked the concrete foundation, and took a few measurements with a tape measure that appeared out of thin air. "You got a solid concrete slab under these pavers," he announced, not to me, but to the porch itself. "We can anchor it so a hurricane won't move it." He turned to me, a glint in his eye. "You want the standard galvanized steel or the fancy powder-coated black?" "Which one looks more intentionally artistic?" I asked. "Powder-coated," he said without hesitation. "Definitely. It'll really pop against the beige." He understood. He truly understood. He quoted me a price that was, to put it mildly, significantly more than the original $100 fine. It was, in fact, more than my mortgage payment. I didn't even flinch. This was no longer about money. It was about the principle of the thing. It was an investment in glorious, unadulterated spite. "Let's do it," I said. Gus stuck out a hand that could probably crush a coconut. We shook on it. "See you Thursday morning, kid," he said, a grin cracking his stony face. "We're gonna make some real ugly art." Thursday arrived with the kind of bright, cheerful sunshine that seemed completely inappropriate for the dark deeds afoot. At 7 a.m. sharp, the suburban tranquility of Harmony Creek Estates was shattered by the guttural roar of a diesel engine. Gus's F-150 pulled up, towing a flatbed trailer. On the trailer, shrouded in a tarp like some kind of military hardware, was my sculpture. Gus and his two-man crew, who looked like they were on day release from a lumberjack convention, began to unload. The moment the tarp came off, the neighborhood's silent surveillance network kicked into high gear. Curtains twitched, blinds were angled just so. I saw Mrs. Gable from next door peer through her window, her mouth a perfecto of shock. Chad, the golden retriever of judgment, started barking, a frantic, confused sound that translated to, "That does not comply with Section 9.4 about lawn ornaments." The rack itself was a thing of brutalist beauty. It was massive, starkly black, and unapologetically industrial. It looked like it had been ripped from the pavement outside Grand Central Station and airlifted into the middle of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. As Gus's team started up a terrifyingly loud hammer drill to punch pilot holes into my porch, a figure emerged from the house directly across the street. It was her, Brenda McMillan, HOA president, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit and a matching visor, ready for her morning power walk. But she wasn't walking. She was marching. She crossed the street with the determined stride of a general about to quash a rebellion. I was ready for her. I stepped outside, holding a fresh mug of coffee, and gave her my most serene, welcoming smile. "Morning, Brenda. Lovely day for some home improvement, isn't it?" Her eyes were wide, fixed on the metal behemoth taking shape on my porch. "Mark, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice tight with disbelief. "What is that thing?" "This?" I said, taking a calm sip of coffee. "Isn't it magnificent? It's my new sculpture." Brenda looked from the rack to me and back again, her brain visibly short-circuiting. "A sculpture? It's a bike rack. That's industrial equipment. You cannot put that here." I adopted the patient, slightly patronizing tone of a museum curator explaining a difficult piece to a confused patron. "Art is subjective, Brenda. This piece is called Suburban Sisyphean Cycle. It explores the crushing monotony of the 9-to-5 grind and the illusion of freedom represented by the bicycle. An object you can ride, but that ultimately brings you back to the same starting point. It's a commentary on the Sisyphean struggle of modern life within the confines of planned communities. I might have laid it on a bit thick at the end there. Brenda stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. But the bylaws, the Architectural Review Committee, you haven't gotten approval. Oh, I'm just getting it installed today, I said breezily. I'll be submitting my application and artist statement to the committee this afternoon, as per bylaw February 1st, 11. Wouldn't want to break the rules now, would we? The look on her face was a cocktail of fury, confusion, and helplessness. It was sublime. She stood there, fuming on the edge of my lawn, as Gus and his team worked with brutal efficiency. The screech of the drill bits biting into concrete, the clang of the steel, the grunts of the men. It was a symphony of construction. Every sound was another nail in the coffin of Brenda's beige-tinted tyranny. At one point, Gus caught my eye and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible thumbs up. By 10 a.m., it was done. The rack was anchored in place, an immovable monument of defiance. It was more massive, more out of place, and more glorious than I had even imagined. It dominated the porch, a stark black slash against the gentle vanilla of my house. But I wasn't finished. I had one final touch. I produced a small, museum-style brass plaque I'd had custom engraved. With a level and a small drill, I mounted it on the siding right next to the rack. It read, Suburban Sisyphean Cycle, 2025. Steel, Concrete, and Bureaucratic Malaise. Artist M. Davis. Brenda read the plaque, made a noise that sounded like a deflating tire, and spun on her heel, power-walking back to her house with a speed and fury that could have won her an Olympic medal. The first battle was over. And I had, without a doubt, won. Phase 2 of Operation Artistic Vengeance commenced that afternoon. I sat down at my computer and, with the fervor of a grad student finishing their thesis, typed up the most ridiculously pretentious artist's statement imaginable. I used every buzzword I had learned in my single semester of art history. I talked about the rack's liminal space, how it deconstructs the domestic paradigm, and how it was a piece of found object art that served as a poignant commentary on communal covenants and the illusion of individual expression. I even threw in a quote from a French philosopher I made up. I printed this masterpiece, attached it to the formal application for the Architectural Review Committee, and sealed it in another one of those fancy cream-colored envelopes. I didn't just put it in the HOA mailbox. I made a ceremony of it. I walked over, held it up for a moment, as if making a sacrificial offering, and slid it in with a dramatic flourish. I was pretty sure Brenda was watching from her window. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was buzzing. The Suburban Telegraph, a complex network of gossiping power walkers and nosy gardeners, was in full swing. My phone started lighting up. A text from Dave, a younger guy who lived a few houses down. Dude, is that a bike rack on your porch? You are a legend! Another from a woman I barely knew. My husband and I are dying laughing. You're our hero. Later that day, as I was watering my long-suffering hydrangeas, old George from the corner house walked by. George had been locked in a years-long, low-grade war with the HOA over a collection of garden gnomes they deemed tacky. He caught my eye, looked at the bike rack, looked back at me, and gave a slow, deliberate, deeply appreciative nod. It was a silent acknowledgement from one trench veteran to another. The battle lines were being drawn, and my little platoon was growing. It took less than 24 hours for the HOA to launch its counteroffensive. There was no polite mail delivery this time. The next afternoon, I found a letter jammed into the handle of my front door. It was a final notice, and a demand for immediate removal of unapproved structure. My original $100 fine had now escalated to $500, with a threat of an additional $50 per day until the structure was removed. The tone had shifted from sterile corporate passive aggression to pure, unadulterated rage. I brought the letter inside, laid it on my kitchen table, and smiled. They were rattled. They were making mistakes. I grabbed a red pen and started correcting their letter like a high school English teacher grading a failed essay. I circled a typo, unapproved. I added a question mark next to a sentence that made no logical sense. Next to their claim that the rack was a blatant violation, I wrote in the margins, "Citation needed. See bylaw February 1st, 11 RE, artistic installations." Then I drafted my formal reply. It was polite, professional, and dripping with condescension. I stated that I was still awaiting the Architectural Review Committee's official review of my submitted application, as was my right according to the very bylaws they were attempting to enforce. I noted that their demand for removal was a premature and unprofessional attempt to circumvent the established due process. I concluded by saying I looked forward to the committee's timely and unbiased aesthetic judgment. I folded it, put it in an envelope, and drove it to the post office. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was official now. This was war by paperwork. The situation escalated from paper to people on a Saturday. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind that normally would have the entire population of Harmony Creek Estates outside, fertilizing their lawns into a state of glowing green perfection. I had taken things a step further in my artistic endeavors. I'd gone to Goodwill and bought 2 of the saddest-looking bicycles you've ever seen. A rusty kid's Huffy with mismatched handlebars and a 1970s 10-speed with flat tires. I'd locked them to my sculpture to give it a more lived-in feel. I was admiring my handiwork, considering adding a basket with some plastic flowers, when a police car glided to a stop at my curb. Not a slow drive-by. A full, decisive stop. My stomach did a little tap dance of anxiety. This was a level I hadn't fully anticipated. 2 officers got out. The first, the driver, was older, probably in his 50s. He had a magnificent mustache that had clearly seen things, and he moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was 2 years from retirement and had zero patience for nonsense. The other was young, sharp, and had the kind of ramrod-straight posture that suggested he'd memorized the entire municipal code for fun. I mentally nicknamed them Miller and By-the-Book Davis. I decided the best strategy was to be proactive. I walked down my driveway to meet them, keeping my hands visible and wearing my most non-threatening, I just pay my taxes and design dog food logos expression. Across the street, the curtains in Brenda's front window were parted just enough to see her silhouette. The puppet master was watching her show. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Something I can help you with?" I asked. Officer Miller, the veteran, squinted at a notepad in his hand. "Afternoon, sir. We got a call about, He paused, clearly trying to read someone else's frantic handwriting. "An unpermitted industrial installation and a potential public nuisance." I followed his gaze to my porch. I couldn't help but smile. "Ah, you must mean my sculpture. Suburban Sisyphean Cycle. It's a commentary." Officer Davis, the younger one, was not amused. He had the humorless expression of a DMV employee. "Sir, your neighbor claims you've installed commercial equipment on your private property without the proper city permits." This was the moment I'd prepared for. My late-night research into city ordinances was about to pay off. "It's art, officer," I said, my tone even and reasonable. "And it's on my private property. I checked the city code before I did anything. Ordinance 34B, subsection C, states that no permit is required for a freestanding decorative structure under 6 feet in height. That rack is 5 feet, 4 inches tall. I measured. Davis looked momentarily stumped. Miller just looked tired. Before either could respond, a new player entered the arena. Brenda, unable to simply watch from afar, marched across her lawn and onto the sidewalk. "He's being ridiculous," she announced to the officers, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "He's mocking the entire community. It's an eyesore. It's attracting cyclists." She said the last word like it was a synonym for cockroaches. I turned to the officers. "As you can see, this is a disagreement with my Homeowners Association president. It's a civil matter. I'm sure you have more important things to do, like actual crimes, than to enforce Brenda's personal feelings about my taste in lawn decor." Officer Miller sighed, a deep, world-weary sound. He had clearly dealt with Brenda before. He turned to her, his voice devoid of any emotion except exhaustion. "Ma'am, is this structure physically on your property?" "Well, no, but..." "Is it blocking a public right-of-way?" "No, but it's hideous and it's lowering." "Ma'am," Miller cut her off, holding up a hand, "this is an HOA dispute. It is not a police matter. We cannot force him to remove something from his own property just because you don't like it." He then turned to his young, eager partner. "It's a civil issue, Davis. Nothing for us to do here." The look of pure, unadulterated deflation on Brenda's face was something I will treasure for the rest of my life. It was better than winning the lottery. It was the look of a tyrant whose primary weapon, calling the authorities, had just been declared a dud. Officer Miller gave Brenda one last, long look. "Ma'am, please do not call 911 for HOA disagreements. That line is for emergencies." He then turned to me, and I swear I saw the corner of his mustache twitch upwards in a tiny, fleeting smile. He gave me a slight nod. "Have a good day, sir. Cool sculpture." They got back in their car and drove away, leaving Brenda standing on the sidewalk, sputtering in a cloud of her own impotent rage. I gave her a polite little wave, turned around, and walked back to my house. The police had been called. The state had, in its own small way, sided with me. I had survived the nuclear option, and the balance of power in Harmony Creek Estates had just shifted dramatically. The police visit was the spark that lit the neighborhood bonfire. My little act of defiance was no longer a private dispute. It was a public spectacle, and everyone had an opinion. The official Harmony Creek Estates community Facebook group, a place normally reserved for lost cat photos and passive-aggressive reminders about recycling day, exploded. It was like watching a digital civil war unfold in real time. The posts were glorious. Brenda's allies, whom I privately dubbed the Beige Brigade, came out in full force. "I am just appalled at the monstrosity at 124 Lilac Lane. It is completely destroying our property values. My husband and I are considering selling." "What's next? A scrapyard in his living room? This is a slippery slope, people. We have rules for a reason." Has anyone thought of the children? What kind of example does this set for them, that they can just ignore the rules they don't like? But then, something wonderful happened. My supporters, the silent majority who had been quietly suffering under Brenda's reign, found their voice. A counter-movement was born. Honestly, it's hilarious. Brenda has been a tyrant for years. She had this coming. You go bike rack guy, #team bike rack. It's his property. If he wants to put a bike rack on it, that's his business. Last year they tried to fine me because my wind chimes were excessively tonal. Enough is enough. I think it's kind of cool. At least it's not another beige box. It shows some personality. My quiet suburban street was now a physical manifestation of the online debate. My immediate neighbors were a perfect cross-section. On my left were the Hendersons, a nervous couple who now avoided eye contact and scurried from their car to their front door, as if my house was radioactive. On my right was Mr. Gable, a man who power-washed his driveway twice a week and had taken to glaring at me with an intensity usually reserved for stubborn oil stains. Every time I got the mail, I could feel his eyes boring into my back. But then there were my allies. The next evening, George, the garden gnome aficionado, shuffled over to my porch carrying a 6-pack of beer. "Brought you some supplies, soldier," he said, his eyes twinkling. We sat on my porch chairs, right next to the sculpture, and drank a beer. He told me about his epic 3-year war with the HOA over a gnome named Norman who held a fishing rod. They'd claimed it violated the rule against whimsical statuary. "They sent me a letter from a lawyer," he said, shaking his head. "A lawyer! Over a gnome! I finally just moved him to the backyard. Always regretted giving in." He looked at my bike rack with deep admiration. "You didn't give in, kid. You doubled down. You're an inspiration." A few days later, a young couple I'd only ever waved to from down the street dropped a small envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a gift card to a local coffee shop and a simple, handwritten note. "Thank you for standing up to them. You're doing the Lord's work." I wasn't just a guy with a bike rack anymore. I was a symbol. I was the leader of the Harmony Creek Rebellion, a revolution I had started completely by accident. And with my enemies glaring and my new allies bringing me beer, I realized there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever. The fun and games came to a screeching halt the following Tuesday. The friendly neighborhood mail carrier, who usually had a cheerful word, just gave me a grim, pitying look and handed me a thick FedEx overnight package. The return address was for a law firm, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. I didn't even need to open it to know it was bad news. The sheer weight of the paper felt threatening. I took it inside and sat down at my kitchen table, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. This felt different. This wasn't a petty fine notice printed on fancy paper. This was the big leagues. I tore open the cardboard sleeve and pulled out a sheaf of documents that was at least 20 pages long. The title at the top was in bold, angry letters: "Formal cease and desist demand." I started reading, and the casual, humorous confidence I'd been feeling began to evaporate. The letter was a masterpiece of intimidation, a whirlwind of legal jargon designed to scare the ever-loving hell out of a normal person. It talked about flagrant disregard for community covenants, aesthetic nuisance, and willful defiance of board directives. It outlined a series of escalating threats. They were retroactively applying a $200 per day fine, which already totaled over $1,000. They were preparing to place a lien on my property. And the kicker, if this went to court and they won, which the letter assured me they would, I would be legally obligated to pay for all of their legal fees. Every last billable hour from the sharks at Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. This was scary, genuinely scary. I'm a guy who designs logos for a living. I argue about kerning and color palettes, not property liens and litigation. For the first time since this whole ridiculous saga began, I felt a cold spike of real fear. I paced my living room, the legal documents clutched in my sweaty hand. Was this worth it? Was a stupid bike rack, a monument to my own stubbornness, worth potentially losing my house over? The image of being financially ruined because of a joke that went too far flashed through my mind. That evening, I saw George out in his yard, repositioning his gnomes. I walked over, the legal letter feeling like a lead weight in my hand. I explained the situation, my voice probably sounding a lot less confident than it had a week ago. He listened patiently, nodding. When I was done, he pointed a wrinkled finger at his back porch. "See that gnome over there? The one with the little blue hat? That's Norman's brother, Neville. He's been in hiding for 2 years. Don't be like me, kid. Don't let them push your gnomes into hiding." He then gave me a slip of paper. "This is Sasha's number. She's a character, but she hates HOAs more than anyone I know. Tell her George with the gnomes sent you. The next day, I found myself in a downtown law office that looked more like a trendy startup. Exposed brick, modern art on the walls, and a distinct lack of dusty law books. Sasha walked out to meet me. She was younger than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a black leather jacket, and an aura of someone who does not suffer fools gladly. I laid out the whole story, from the first $100 fine to the cease and desist letter. I expected her to be serious, maybe even a little judgmental. Instead, as I told the story, her expression morphed from professional interest to unconcealed, delighted glee. When I finished, she picked up the letter from Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, and read it, a huge grin spreading across her face. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said, almost purring. "They cited aesthetic nuisance? That's fantastic. Aesthetic standards are notoriously subjective and incredibly difficult to enforce in court." She looked up at me, her eyes sparkling. "And you filed the formal application for the sculpture? Quoting their own bylaw? Mark, you're the perfect client. You followed their own stupid rules to the letter. You've built a beautiful little trap, and they walked right into it." A wave of relief washed over me. "So I'm not completely screwed?" Sasha laughed. "Screwed? We're going to have so much fun with this. They have no idea how much money they're about to waste trying to fight this. Now let's draft a response, shall we?" Her response was a work of art in its own right. It was a polite, professional, and utterly brutal takedown of every point in their letter. It pointed out the HOA's bad faith in failing to follow their own architectural review process. It accused them of selective enforcement, citing, with my permission, George's gnome as a prior example. It coolly informed them that any attempt to place a lien on my property would be met with an immediate and aggressive countersuit for harassment and frivolous litigation. But the final paragraph was pure Sasha. It read, "Furthermore, my client considers your threatening correspondence to be a form of performance art in itself, and he is considering incorporating facsimiles of your letters into his next installation, tentatively titled Paper Tiger, Beige Cage. We trust this will not be necessary." She sent it off. The ball was back in their court, and for the first time I felt like I had a queen on my side of the chessboard. The response to Sasha's letter was not another letter. It was a summons. A notice was posted on every door in Harmony Creek Estates. Emergency community meeting. It was to be held the following Wednesday in the community clubhouse. The sole agenda item printed in a large, ominous font. Discussion and vote on the unapproved installation at 124 Lilac Lane and proposed remediation. This was it. The final showdown. The OK Corral, but with folding chairs and bad coffee. The evening of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It seemed every single resident of Harmony Creek was there. The room was a sea of beige, gray, and pastel, the official colors of suburban anxiety. The air was thick with tension and the smell of the burnt coffee Brenda had brewed. On one side of the room sat the Beige Brigade, a tight-lipped collection of Brenda's allies, whispering amongst themselves and shooting me dirty looks. On the other side sat my supporters, George the gnome owner, the young couple who gave me the gift card, and a surprising number of other residents who just looked fed up. I sat in the middle, a one-man Switzerland, with Sasha next to me, looking as calm and cool as if she were at a movie premiere. Brenda stood at a cheap wooden podium, gavel in hand. She banged it with far more force than was necessary. "This emergency meeting of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association is now in session," she declared, her voice trembling slightly, with a mixture of rage and righteousness. She launched into her case, complete with a PowerPoint presentation she'd clearly spent days creating. The first slide was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my bike rack, taken from an unflattering angle. She clicked through slides filled with bullet points about community standards, aesthetic harmony, and the sanctity of the bylaws. She spoke of the sacred trust that had been broken, the visual assault on the neighborhood's character. She made it sound like I hadn't installed a bike rack, but had opened a nuclear waste dump on my front lawn. Then, the HOA's lawyer, a tired-looking man from Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, got up and gave a monotonous drone of a presentation about the legal grounds for forcing removal and levying fines. He kept using phrases like incontrovertible violation and clear precedent, but he couldn't hide the fact that he was on shaky ground, and he knew it. Finally, Brenda's voice dripped with venom as she said, "And now we will allow the homeowner, Mr. Davis, to speak." All eyes turned to me. I felt a flutter of nerves, but then I looked at Sasha, who gave me a small, confident nod. I walked up to the front of the room, but I didn't stand behind the podium. I just stood in the open space in front of my neighbors, hands casually in my pockets. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice calm. "We're all here tonight, on a perfectly good Wednesday, to discuss a bike rack. Let that sink in for a minute. Not a crime wave, not a zoning issue, but a place to put bicycles." A few people chuckled nervously. "This whole thing," I continued, holding up the very first violation letter, "started because of this. A $100 fine for leaving my bike on my own porch. A porch I pay a mortgage on. Now, I could have just paid it. It would have been easier. But it felt wrong. It felt like being punished for using my own home in a perfectly harmless way. I looked around the room, making eye contact with people I recognized. So, yes, I did something a little ridiculous. I'll admit it. I installed a 10-bike rack and called it art. It was a joke, a protest, a way of saying, if you're going to enforce a rule this absurd, I'm going to respond with something equally absurd. This was never really about a bike rack, I said, my voice getting stronger. It was about a letter, and then another letter, and then a threat to put a lien on my house. It was about rules being used not to maintain a community, but to control it, to bully people into perfect beige conformity. I gestured to the rack outside, visible through the clubhouse window. My sculpture isn't called Suburban Sisyphean Cycle anymore. Now it's a monument to that. It's a reminder that every now and then you have to push back. You have to stand up and say, this is my home, and I will not be fined for a bicycle. I finished, and there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, before Brenda could slam her gavel, a voice piped up from the back. It was George. He stood up, his old knees cracking. He's right, George said, his voice surprisingly firm. For 3 years, this board, led by Brenda, has been sending me threatening letters about a garden gnome. A gnome! I finally gave in, and I've been kicking myself for it ever since. Mark didn't give in. He fought back. And I, for one, think we need more of that around here. Then the young woman who had given me the gift card stood up. They told us we had to repaint our front door because it was too glossy. It was the same color, just a different finish. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. A dozen other people started voicing their own stories, their own long-suppressed grievances with the HOA's overreach. The meeting devolved from my trial into a full-blown town hall rebellion against Brenda's leadership. Brenda banged her gavel frantically, her face crimson. "Order! Order! We need to vote on the motion!" The motion was to authorize the board to take any and all legal action necessary to force me to remove the rack and pay the accumulated fines. It was the kill shot. They called for a show of hands. I held my breath. Brenda and her 4 allies on the board raised their hands immediately. That was 5 votes in favor. Then the hands of my supporters went up. George, the young couple, the wind chime lady. And then more, and more. People who had been silent for years were now raising their hands in defiance. When the count was done, the result was announced in a choked voice by the board's secretary. 5 in favor, 28 against. The motion was defeated. A wave of applause and cheers erupted from my side of the room. Brenda stood at the podium, gavel in her limp hand, utterly and publicly defeated. Her reign was over. The morning after the meeting felt like the first day after a long storm. The sun seemed brighter. The air felt cleaner. The neighborhood was different. As I got my mail, Mr. Henderson from next door, who had been avoiding me for weeks, actually gave me a small, shy smile and a nod. Even Mr. Gable, the power washer enthusiast, grunted a morning that sounded less like a threat and more like grudging respect. The HOA was in complete chaos. A week later, a notice went out. Brenda McMillan had resigned from her presidency, citing a desire to spend more time with her family. We all knew what it really meant. She had been dethroned. And the bike rack? It remains. It's no longer a symbol of defiance. It's a bizarre but beloved neighborhood landmark. I fully committed to the bit. I started a collection of weird and wonderful bikes that I rotate on the rack. One week it's a tiny clown bike I found at a flea market. The next, it's a bright pink tandem bike. Last week I had a unicycle locked to the end spot. The neighborhood kids love it. They treat it like a rotating public art exhibit. George, in a final act of victory, donated one of his gnomes to the cause. It's a little fellow wearing a tiny, custom-painted cycling helmet, and he now sits proudly on the porch next to the brass plaque. He is the official guardian of the sculpture. The story ends a few months later. It's a warm evening, and I'm sitting on my porch with George. We're drinking a beer, watching the sunset paint the sky shades of orange and purple. A moving truck is parked down the street. A new family is moving in. We watch as the new owner, a man with a wild beard and a t-shirt for some band I've never heard of, unloads a large, abstract metal sculpture of a flamingo from the back of his truck and places it squarely in the middle of his front lawn. George lets out a low chuckle and takes a sip of his beer. "Well, look at that," he says, nodding towards the flamingo. "You started a revolution, kid." I smile and look at my ridiculous, beautiful 10-bike sculpture, gleaming in the evening light. It's a permanent monument to the time the Harmony Creek HOA picked a fight with the wrong graphic designer. "Nah," I say, raising my bottle in a toast to the flamingo. "I just built a bike rack.